Surah tightened her grip on her hatchlings as the biting wind of the landing bay swirled around them. The harsh hum of the Naren Council's final judgment still echoed in her mind. You are no longer Naren. You are an outcast. Leave, and take your defects with you. She had tried to remain composed as they spoke those words, but her two daughters, Trim and Zlay, trembled in her arms. Their small, violet faces, so different from the bright, polished hues of other Naren children, made them stand out as something undesirable. Trim's frail body slumped against her, while Zlay clung to her leg, her golden eyes wide with fear. The crowd surrounding them, elders, warriors, even the young, watched in stony silence. Some whispered among themselves, their gaze flitting to her children. The word defective passed from one to another, a poisonous brand her family had been forced to bear since her daughter's hatching. The Naren culture valued perfection above all else. Their philosophy, rooted in millennia of conquest and survival, was simple. Strength ensured survival, and survival guaranteed the propagation of their people. Weakness, in any form, was a disease that must be excised. Surah's daughters, born with soft bones and a weaker constitution, were seen as living symbols of failure. Her mate's death had sealed their fate. Once a respected warrior, he had fallen in a battle defending the Naren fleet. At first, his sacrifice earned the family's sympathy, but when Surah's daughters began showing signs of frailty, that sympathy curdled into disdain. Whispers grew, accusing her of poor lineage, as though her genetics alone had brought shame upon her kind. They exiled her not with fury, but with a cold efficiency. To them, Surah and her daughters were a burden best forgotten. The ship that carried them away was no better than a cargo vessel, its seats stiff and unforgiving. Surah sat in silence, the hum of the engines the only sound, as she held her daughters close. Trim coughed weakly, a rattling sound that made Surah's heart ache. Zlay, though older, had always been quiet, but now her silence felt heavier. "Where are we going, Mother?" Zlay finally asked, her voice thin but curious. Surah hesitated, her sharp claws tapping against the edge of the seat. She didn't have an answer, only a vague hope that somewhere, someone might take them in. "A place where we'll be safe," she said at last, though the words felt hollow. Zlay nodded, but Surah could see the doubt in her daughter's golden eyes. Days turned into weeks. Surah's stolen vessel, a small transport ship she had taken from the Naren fleet out of desperation, floated through the emptiness of space. The ship's rations were barely enough to sustain them. The nutrient bars were meant for single warriors, not a mother and her children. Trim's fragile health worsened. His once vibrant violet skin dulled to a pale lilac, and his energy waned with every passing day. Surah spent her nights studying star charts, searching for habitable planets, or trading outposts where they might find sanctuary. Each one she reached out to turn her away. The Naren reputation preceded her, their strict isolationist policies making it clear that outsiders were unwelcome. One particularly harsh rejection came from a merchant station she had hoped would be different. "Why should we take in a Naren outcast?" the dockmaster sneered over the comm. "You're all arrogant until you need something, aren't you? We don't want your kind here." Surah closed the channel before he could say more, her claws digging into the control panel. Her pride warred with her desperation. The Naren taught her to be self-reliant, to accept nothing from others unless it could be repaid. But she could not repay, and she could not save her daughters on her own. Her breaking point came days later. Trim lay curled in the ship's tiny sleeping quarters, his breathing shallow and uneven. Zlay sat beside him, holding his hand, her small frame shaking with silent tears. Surah knelt beside her children, pressing her clawed hand to Trim's forehead. His skin burned under her touch. "Mother!" Zlay's voice broke as she spoke. "Will Trim be okay?" Surah's throat tightened. She could not lie to her daughter, but the truth was unbearable. "He's strong," she said softly. "Stronger than they think. We'll find help." The moment she spoke, a blinking light on the ship's console caught her attention. A transmission, faint and garbled, broke through the silence. "This is Captain J of the Vagabond. Looks like you're in trouble." The voice was deep, slightly rough, but strangely warm. Surah frowned, her claws tapping the console as she responded. I don't need help, she said sharply, her Naren pride instinctively flaring. Ah, came the reply, laced with humor. Well, your ship's sputtering like it's about to give up, and I can see from here that you're low on power. So yeah, I think you do. Surah's lips tightened. She had encountered opportunists before, scavengers looking to prey on the weak. But this human, if her translator was correct, did not sound hostile. If this is a trick, she began. It's not, the voice interrupted. Aldoc will talk. No strings attached. Surah hesitated. Trim's labored breathing filled the silence. She had no other choice. Very well, she said, her voice firm. But if you harm my children, I will end you. The human laughed, a sound that somehow eased her tension. Fair enough. Sit tight. Minutes later, the vagabond docked with her ship. When the human entered, Surah studied him carefully. He was taller than her, his frame lean but strong. His dark brown hair stuck out in uneven tufts, and his worn clothing spoke of a life spent in constant motion. Despite his unkempt appearance, his eyes were sharp, taking in her and her children with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Let's get you fed first, he said, his tone light but firm. Then we'll figure out what's next. As he handed bowls of strange orange food to her daughters, Surah watched cautiously. Her daughters' smiles, faint but genuine, were the first she had seen in weeks. For the first time, Surah allowed herself to hope. Surah stepped cautiously onto the vagabond. Her sharp eyes swept over the cramped interior, assessing every detail. The ship seemed to reflect its owner. A chaotic mix of mismatched panels, exposed wiring, and a stubborn refusal to fall apart despite its obvious age. The air smelled faintly of burnt metal and something savory, an unexpected warmth after the sterile cold of her own vessel. Jay walked ahead, his stride easy and unhurried, as though entirely unaware of how strange it was for a human and a Naren widow to occupy the same space. Make yourselves at home, he said over his shoulder, gesturing vaguely to the cluttered living area. Home? Surah's claws flexed as she took in the piles of tools, stacked crates, and patched up furniture that looked more scavenged than built. A faded earth flag hung lopsided on one wall, next to a framed image of a green and blue planet she assumed was his homeworld. Her daughters, however, were less concerned with the decor. Zlay tugged at her mother's arm. Is this where we'll stay? Temporarily, Surah replied, though she had no plan beyond the next meal. Jay glanced back, crouching to Zlay's level. It's not fancy, but it's sturdy. What do you think, kiddo? Zlay hesitated, then gave a small nod. Her younger sister, Trim, peeked out from behind Surah, her violet skin pale, but her eyes bright with curiosity. Let's get some food in you first, Jay said, rising. I've got just the thing. He disappeared into what she assumed was the galley. Surah listened as he rummaged through cabinets, muttering about misplaced supplies. This is inefficient, she said, stepping closer. Jay popped his head out, his hair sticking up like he had been wrestling with gravity itself. What is your organization? She said flatly. Your systems lack order. How do you find anything? He grinned as though she had complimented him. It's organized chaos. You'd be amazed what turns up when you stop looking for it. Surah narrowed her eyes, but said nothing. Minutes later, he emerged with bowls of steaming food. The smell was unfamiliar, but inviting. It's stew, he explained. Well, kind of human version. Got enough protein to get you back on your feet. The girls ate hesitantly at first, their small hands clutching the bowls. When Zlay hummed in approval, Trim followed her lead, scooping the stew into her mouth with surprising enthusiasm. You're full of surprises, aren't you? Surah said, watching the scene unfold. Jay shrugged. Part of the job. Never know who'll need a hot meal out here. After the meal, Jay led them to a small storage bay. The walls were lined with mismatched shelves, crates stacked in every corner. This used to be my spare parts room, he said. Figured I'd clear it out for you. It's not much, but it'll give you some privacy. Surah surveyed the space. It was modest, but he had gone to some effort. A few crates had been stacked to form makeshift beds, each topped with blankets that, while fraying at the edges, looked warm. Why go to such trouble? She asked, her tone measured. Jay leaned against the doorway, crossing his arms. Because you needed it. It's that simple. Simple. The word grated against her instincts. In Naren culture, help came at a cost. Alliances were transactional, favors recorded and repaid. Yet this human stood there, offering them sanctuary without asking for anything in return. You're either very kind or very foolish, she said. Jay chuckled. Can't I be both? The next morning, Sarah awoke to the sound of Trim coughing. She hurried to her daughter's side, feeling the faint heat radiating from her skin. She's been sick for a while, hasn't she? Jay's voice came from the doorway. Sarah stiffened, not realizing he had entered. It's not contagious. Her body, she stopped herself, unwilling to admit what she knew others had judged her for. Her body struggling, Jay finished for her. He walked over, crouching beside Trim. She's tougher than she looks, though. How can you say that? Sarah asked, her voice sharp. You don't know her. Jay met her gaze, his expression steady. I've seen it before. Strength isn't always about muscles or fighting. Sometimes it's just surviving when everything's stacked against you. The word struck something deep within her. Sarah studied him, searching for a motive. He didn't look at her with pity, nor did he flinch from her alien features. Later that day, Jay took Sarah to the cockpit. The controls were a patchwork of old and new technology, buttons and levers interspersed with touchscreens. Welcome to the bridge, he said, gesturing grandly. The heart of the vagabond. Ugly, but she works. Sarah's gaze flicked over the panels. You fly this alone? Yep, he said, settling into the pilot's seat. Well, me and whatever luck the universe decides to throw my way. She frowned. Why? Humans have a collective culture, do they not? Shouldn't you be with your people? Jay's smile faltered. Used to be. Lost my family a few years back. Been flying solo ever since. Easier that way. The pain behind his words was subtle, but it was there. Sarah understood loss too well to pry further. Instead, she said, Your ship is unconventional. He barked a laugh. You're being polite. She's a mess. But she's mine. Sarah allowed herself a faint smile. In his chaotic world, there was a strange kind of order. That night, as her daughter slept soundly for the first time in weeks, Sarah found herself in the galley with Jay. He sipped from a metal mug, his eyes distant. Why did you help us? She asked finally. He set the mug down, considering her question. Because someone helped me once. When I lost everything, I thought that was it. But a stranger gave me a second chance. Seemed right to pay it forward. Sarah studied him, the puzzle of this human growing more complex. Jay was unlike anyone she had ever met. Alien in the truest sense, but somehow familiar. You are strange, she said softly. Jay grinned. Takes one to know one. For the first time in a long while, Sarah laughed. It was a small sound, but it carried something she hadn't felt in years, hope. Sarah sat rigidly in the vagabond's galley, watching as her daughters played with a small holographic star map Jay had given them. The faint blue projections of planets and constellations danced over the table, eliciting delighted giggles from Zlay and curious stares from Trim. Despite the warmth of the moment, Sarah's thoughts lingered on the ship itself. The vagabond was unlike any vessel she had ever encountered. Its every surface seemed to tell a story of struggle and adaptation, from the mismatched control panels to the patched walls that bore the scars of countless repairs. Efficiency was a cornerstone of Naren engineering, and yet, here was a ship that defied that principle entirely. Jay appeared in the doorway. A smudge of oil streaked across his cheek, and his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked with small burns and cuts. He carried a toolbox in one hand and a tangled cluster of wires in the other. Let me guess, Sarah said, tilting her head. Something has broken again. Jay grinned, dropping the wires onto the table with a clatter. Not broken, just cranky, like a stubborn old friend who needs a little coaxing to get moving. Your metaphors are as inefficient as your ship, she replied, her tone dry. And yet here we are, Jay said, gesturing around him. Flying just fine. Well, mostly. Before she could respond, Trim reached out to touch one of the wires. Her small, Clawed fingers brushed against the frayed ends, and Surah immediately moved to stop her. "Do not touch that," she said sharply, pulling her daughter's hand away. "It's fine," Jay said, stepping forward. "It's not live. I'd never leave anything dangerous lying around where the kiddos can reach it." Surah glared at him, her tail twitching in irritation. "You are far too careless. My daughters are not your responsibility." "Maybe not," Jay said, his voice softening. "But they're here, and I don't mind looking out for them." The sincerity in his words caught her off guard. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before turning her attention back to Trim. The next day, Jay invited Surah to the engine room. It was a cramped space, filled with humming machinery and exposed pipes that pulsed faintly with energy. The air smelled of ozone and engine grease. "This is the heart of the Vagabond," Jay said, spreading his arms like a proud parent showing off a child's achievement. Surah's eyes narrowed as she scanned the room. "It looks unstable. She's held together by blood, sweat, and duct tape," Jay said cheerfully. "But she's reliable." "I fail to see how this chaos could be considered reliable," Surah said, stepping closer to inspect one of the consoles. Its surface was scratched and scuffed, with several buttons missing their labels. Jay handed her a wrench, his grin never faltering. "Why don't you give it a try? That valve over there needs tightening. It's been leaking coolant." Surah hesitated, then took the wrench with a resigned sigh. She knelt beside the valve and began to work, her movements precise and methodical. The hiss of escaping coolant subsided as she tightened the mechanism. "Not bad," Jay said, leaning against a nearby wall. "You're a natural." "I have extensive experience with Naren engineering," Surah replied, brushing her hands clean. "This contraption is hardly a challenge." Jay laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the days passed, Surah found herself begrudgingly impressed by Jay's resourcefulness. While his methods were far from conventional, they were undeniably effective. She began to notice the small details, the way he repurposed old components, turning scraps into functional systems, the care he took in maintaining the ship despite its haphazard design. Her daughters grew increasingly attached to him. Zlay followed him around the ship, peppering him with questions about human technology and customs. Jay answered each one with patience, often punctuating his explanations with jokes that made Zlay giggle. "Why does this panel flicker?" she asked one afternoon, pointing to a screen in the cockpit. "Because it's dramatic," Jay replied, winking. "The Vagabond likes to keep things interesting." Zlay laughed, her golden eyes bright. Even Trim, who remained shy and reserved, began to warm to Jay. One evening, as the family sat together in the galley, Jay pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were various trinkets, coins, stones, and tiny figurines that he had collected during his travels. "Pick one," he said, sliding the box toward Trim. She hesitated, glancing at Surah for approval. When her mother gave a small nod, Trim reached into the box and pulled out a smooth, blue stone. "That's from Earth," Jay said, his voice warm. "It's called lapis lazuli. Thought it might bring you some luck." Trim clutched the stone to her chest, a faint smile playing on her lips. The peace aboard the Vagabond was short-lived. One morning, as Surah joined Jay in the cockpit, an alarm blared, the sharp sound cutting through the stillness. "What is it?" she demanded, her claws instinctively flexing. Jay's expression darkened as he scanned the readings. "We got company." Surah leaned over his shoulder, her heart sinking as she recognized the sleek, angular design of the approaching ship. "Naren scouts," she said, her voice low. "Friends of yours?" Jay asked, his tone grim. "Hardly," she replied. "They've come to drag me back. Or worse." Jay's jaw tightened. "Not on my watch." The Vagabond shuddered as he pushed the engines to full throttle. The scout ship pursued, its weapons locking onto them. Surah gripped the back of Jay's chair, her mind racing. "They will not give up," she said. "Their orders will be absolute." "Then we'll outsmart them," Jay said, his hands flying over the controls. He guided the ship into an asteroid field, weaving through the massive rocks with reckless precision. The scout ship followed, its sleek design allowing it to match their movements. "They're gaining," Surah warned. Not for long, Jay said, a fierce grin spreading across his face. He flipped a series of switches, and a cluster of small drones deployed from the vagabond's underbelly. The drones emitted bursts of bright light and static, disrupting the scout ship's sensors. What are those? Surah asked. Homemade decoys, Jay said. Pretty, aren't they? The scout ship faltered, its movements erratic as it struggled to navigate the interference. Surah's eyes widened. You're not as foolish as you seem. Thanks, Jay said, steering the vagabond out of the asteroid field. Now hang on. This ride's about to get bumpy. He activated the ship's afterburners, propelling them forward at breakneck speed. The scout ship disappeared from the sensors, unable to keep up. As the alarms faded and the vagabond returned to normal speed, Surah exhaled, her claws retracting. You could have gotten us killed, she said, her voice sharp. Jay turned to her, his grin unrepentant. But I didn't. For the first time, Surah allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps there is more to you than chaos after all. Careful, Jay said, winking. That almost sounded like a compliment. Surah shook her head, but there was a glimmer of respect in her golden eyes. For the first time, she began to believe that, together, they might just survive. Surah paced the galley of the vagabond, her claws clicking rhythmically against the metal floor. The ship was too quiet. Trim and Zlay rested in their makeshift quarters. The warmth of the blankets Jay had scavenged cocooning their small bodies. But even asleep, Trim's frailty lingered in Surah's mind. Her shallow breathing, the pallor of her violet skin, the way her energy seemed to ebb like a receding tide. All of it felt like a countdown. Jay's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking her thoughts. Surah, can you come to the cockpit? We need to talk. She straightened, her tail flicking with tension. On my way. When she arrived, Jay was leaning back in his chair, his boots propped up on the console. The starfield outside the viewport cast a faint glow, illuminating his face. His usual easygoing demeanor seemed subdued, replaced with something quieter. What is it? She asked, crossing her arms. Jay gestured to the display. We got a problem. There's a station about 12 hours out. Decent medical facilities, good supplies, but he hesitated, running a hand through his disheveled hair. It's neutral territory. If the Narans have put out any kind of alert for you, there's a good chance someone there will know. Surah's jaw tightened. You think they'll report me? It's possible, he said. But staying out here isn't an option. Not with Trim getting worse. She hated that he was right. Every instinct in her screamed to avoid the risk, to keep moving, but her daughter's labored breathing haunted her every moment. What do you suggest? Jay leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. We go in careful. I'll do the talking. You and the kids stay on the ship, out of sight. If we're lucky, we'll get what we need and leave before anyone notices. And if we're not lucky, then we'll figure it out, he said, his voice steady. We always do. 12 hours later, the vagabond docked at a sprawling station orbiting a pale green planet. The station was a maze of interconnected modules, its architecture a blend of alien designs and human practicality. Lights flickered intermittently along the docking corridor as Jay lowered the ship's ramp. You sure about this? Surah asked, her voice low. Jay offered her a reassuring smile. I've been to worse places. This one's practically a resort by comparison. Somehow, I doubt that. He chuckled and adjusted the strap of the satchel slung over his shoulder. Stay sharp, Surah. I'll be back before you know it. She watched as he disappeared into the crowd, her claws flexing anxiously at her sides. Jay moved through the station with practiced ease, his every step deliberate. He kept his head down, his gaze scanning for signs of trouble. The market was bustling, filled with traders hawking wares from every corner of the galaxy. He approached a stall run by a reptilian merchant, its scales shimmering in shades of bronze. The merchant eyed him warily as he spoke. I'm looking for medical supplies. Something for respiratory issues, preferably broad spectrum. The merchant clicked its tongue. Expensive. Jay slid a small pouch of credits across the counter. And worth every unit. The merchant inspected the pouch, then nodded. It disappeared behind a curtain, emerging moments later with a case of vials. Good stuff, it said. Strong. But you didn't get it here. Jay grinned. Of course not. He turned to leave, but a voice stopped him. Well, look what the void dragged in. Jay froze, his smile faltering. He turned slowly to face a towering figure clad in a sleek black uniform. A Naren. Back on the ship, Surah felt the first pangs of unease. Jay had been gone too long. She paced the length of the galley, her tail lashing behind her. Mother, Zlay's voice broke the silence. Surah turned to see her eldest standing in the doorway, her golden eyes wide with worry. Where is Captain Jay? He'll be back soon, Surah said, though she wasn't sure if it was a promise or a hope. Jay stood rigid as the Naren's cold gaze raked over him. The alien's features were sharp, its scales gleaming in the station's dim light. You've been busy, the Naren said, its voice like gravel. This station has ears, human. Word is you've been seen with someone interesting. Jay's jaw tightened. Don't know what you're talking about. The Naren's lip curled. You're a terrible liar. Where is she? Jay forced a grin. If you're so curious, why don't you check your databanks? Oh, wait. Narens don't share with outsiders, do they? The Naren snarled, stepping closer. Jay didn't flinch, but he could feel the tension building. Before the situation could escalate, a small explosion echoed through the market. Smoke filled the air as a nearby stall burst into flames, sending traders scattering in every direction. Jay seized the distraction, bolting into the chaos. Surah heard the faint rumble of the explosion even from the ship. Her heart raced as she scanned the viewport, her claws digging into the console. Moments later, the ramp hissed open, and Jay stumbled inside, coughing as he clutched the case of vials. What happened? Surah demanded. Ran into one of your buddies, he said, his voice hoarse. Station security isn't what it used to be, so I made my own exit. She glared at him, but quickly took the case from his hands, inspecting the vials. Are these what we need? Best they had, he said, sinking into a chair. Your people don't mess around, do they? No, Surah said. They do not. Jay met her gaze, his expression serious. We gotta be careful. If one of them saw me, more will come. Surah nodded. Then we'll be ready. That night, as the ship drifted through the void, Surah administered the medicine to Trim. The child stirred slightly, her breathing easing for the first time in days. Zlay sat beside her, holding her sister's hand. She'll get better now, won't she? She will, Surah said, her voice steady. We will keep her safe. In the cockpit, Jay stared out at the stars, the weight of their journey pressing down on him. For all his bravado, he knew they were running out of places to hide. But he also knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't abandon them. Not now. Not ever. The Vagabond floated in the endless black, its engines humming faintly as it pushed forward into the void. Inside, the air hung heavy with unspoken tension. Surah sat at the galley table, her sharp claws idly tracing the worn surface of the metal. Her mind was a tempest of worry, circling back to Trim's pale face and shallow breaths. The medicine had steadied her youngest daughter's condition, but the girl was still far from well. Across the room, Zlay sat on the floor with one of Jay's holographic projectors. She twisted the device in her small hands, its blue light flickering as a crude star map appeared, spinning lazily in the air. What's that one? She asked, pointing to a bright dot. Jay leaned against the doorway, arms crossed and a lopsided grin on his face. That's Antares. Big, red, and mean, kind of like your mom. Zlay giggled. Surah's eyes narrowed. I would caution you against comparing me to a celestial object, she said coolly. Noted, Jay replied, his grin widening. Before the exchange could go any further, a faint beep echoed from the cockpit. Jay's smile faded as he straightened. Transmission, he muttered. Surah stood, her claws clicking against the floor as she followed him. Who will be transmitting out here? Good question, Jay said, dropping into the pilot's seat. He tapped a button, and the display flared to life. The image that appeared made Surah's stomach twist. The humanoid figure on the screen had pale green skin and unervingly luminous eyes that seemed to pierce through the interface. Captain Jay of the Vagabond, the figure said, its voice smooth and deliberate. We have a situation to discuss. Jay leaned back, folding his arms. Do we? Because I don't recall signing up for one. The alien's expression remained calm, though its glowing eyes narrowed slightly. You are harboring fugitives. Sarah's shoulders tensed, her tail flicking involuntarily. Jay raised an eyebrow. Fugitives? That's a big word. Care to be more specific? The alien's gaze shifted to Surah, and its lips curled into something resembling a smile. A Naren exile and her offspring. Their presence on your vessel is known, Captain. I suggest you turn them over to me. Jay snorted. And why would I do that? Because the alternative is far worse, the alien replied, its voice cold. The Narens do not forgive. They do not forget. If you continue to harbor this liability, your ship will be their next target. Jay leaned forward, resting his elbows on the console. See, here's the thing. You're threatening me, but you're not really saying what's in it for you. Why do you want them? That is irrelevant. Not to me, Jay said, his tone sharp. I don't deal with vague villains. You want me to betray my crew? You'd better give me a damn good reason. The alien's calm facade faltered for a moment, a flicker of irritation crossing its face. You have until the end of this transmission to comply. Refuse, and you will face the consequences. Jay smirked. Good talk. He reached over and cut the transmission, the screen going dark. You are reckless, Sarah said, her voice like steel. Jay turned to her, his expression serious. And you're welcome. I didn't see you rushing to make a counteroffer. There is no negotiating with those who serve the Narens, she replied. They will not stop. Good thing I don't plan on stopping either, Jay said, rising from his chair. We've got a few hours before they figure out where we're headed. Time to get creative. Sarah followed him into the cargo bay, her claws flexing anxiously. What are you planning? Jay rummaged through a pile of spare parts, his movements quick and deliberate. They'll send a patrol ship after us. Standard procedure. We can't outrun them, but we can trick them into thinking we're somewhere we're not. He held up a small cylindrical device and grinned. Decoy beacon. I rig it to mimic our engine signature, drop it in the nearest asteroid belt, and they chase a ghost while we slip away. Sarah tilted her head. And if they don't fall for it? Jay's grin didn't falter. Then we improvise. The plan went into motion quickly. Jay piloted the Vagabond toward a dense asteroid field, the jagged rocks tumbling slowly through the void. Sarah sat beside him, monitoring the sensors for signs of pursuit. They're closing in, she said, her voice tight. Jay nodded, his hands steady on the controls. Good. Let's give them something to chase. He activated the decoy beacon, launching it into the asteroid field. The small device emitted a steady pulse, its signal indistinguishable from the Vagabond's engines. On the display, the patrol ship veered toward the beacon, its trajectory shifting as it locked onto the false target. It's working, Sarah said, her tone laced with cautious optimism. Of course it is, Jay replied. I built it. Before she could respond, the proximity alarm blared. Another ship appeared on the display, smaller but faster than the patrol vessel. Backup, Sarah muttered. Of course they brought backup, Jay said, gripping the controls tighter. Looks like we're doing this the hard way. The smaller ship closed the distance quickly, its weapons lighting up as it fired on the Vagabond. Jay banked hard, the ship groaning in protest as it dodged the blasts. Sarah moved to the weapons console, her claws flying over the controls. Your ship's defenses are pitiful. Then make them less pitiful, Jay shot back. She growled softly but complied, rerouting power to the forward cannons. The Vagabond returned fire, its shots grazing the enemy ship's shields. Keep them busy, Jay said. I've got an idea. He veered the ship toward a cluster of larger asteroids, weaving between them with a precision that surprised even Sarah. The enemy ship followed, its weapons struggling to lock onto the nimble vessel. Now, Jay yelled. Sarah fired a burst from the rear cannons, striking a nearby asteroid. The resulting explosion sent debris hurtling toward the enemy ship, its shields flickering under the impact. The smaller ship wavered, then broke off pursuit, retreating into the black. Jay exhaled, slumping back in his seat. That was fun. Surah glared at him. Your definition of fun is questionable. Yeah, he said, grinning. But it worked. As the vagabond left the asteroid field behind, Surah leaned back in her chair, her tension slowly easing. You risk too much, she said softly. Jay glanced at her, his expression uncharacteristically serious. So do you. For a moment, their gazes met, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Next time, Surah said, breaking the silence, we need a better plan. Jay chuckled. Next time, I'll let you come up with it. Surah allowed herself a small smile. Despite the chaos, she couldn't deny that Jay's reckless ingenuity had kept them alive. For now, that was enough. The vagabond emerged from hyperspace, the shimmering tendrils of faster-than-light travel collapsing into a view of a sprawling star system. The central sun burned a soft gold, casting light on a planet below that glowed with hues of green and blue. It looked alive, untouched, and inviting. Jay leaned forward in his seat, letting out a low whistle. Now that's a sight. Surah, seated beside him, studied the planet with careful precision. Her golden eyes narrowed as she scanned its features on the display. Oceans wrapped around lush continents, clouds swirling lazily in the atmosphere. It's habitable, she said, her voice betraying a cautious optimism. Not just habitable, Jay said, gesturing to the readings. It's perfect. No heavy radiation, no poisonous air, and no signs of intelligent life. A clean slate. Zlay and Trim peeked into the cockpit, their small hands gripping the doorway. Are we stopping here? Zlay asked, her voice tinged with excitement. Surah hesitated, her tail twitching slightly. Perhaps, but we must be sure it is safe. Jay smirked. Then let's find out. He eased the ship into the planet's atmosphere, the vagabond shuddering slightly as it descended through layers of thick clouds. The turbulence smoothed as they broke through, revealing a vast landscape of forests, rivers, and rolling hills. Jay guided the ship toward an open clearing near a sparkling lake. The engines hummed softly as the vessel touched down, its landing struts settling into the soft ground. The air outside was warm and fragrant, filled with the sense of blooming vegetation and fresh water. Trim stood on unsteady legs as she stepped out of the ship, clutching Zlay's hand. The younger girl inhaled deeply, her pale violet skin brightening slightly in the sunlight. It's beautiful, Zlay said, her golden eyes wide with wonder. Surah followed them, her sharp gaze scanning the horizon for any threats. The landscape stretched out peacefully, the only sounds coming from rustling leaves and the distant call of alien birds. Jay emerged last, carrying a small pack slung over his shoulder. He stretched, letting out a satisfied sigh. Feels like paradise, he said. Surah crossed her arms. Appearances can be deceiving. Yeah, but sometimes they're not, Jay replied, flashing her a grin. The group began to explore, Jay leading the way with a makeshift scanner in hand. The device beeped occasionally, confirming what their initial readings had shown. The planet was rich in resources and devoid of intelligent life. This place could work, Jay said as they reached the edge of a riverbank. He knelt, dipping his fingers into the water. Clean enough to drink. Surah crouched beside him, her claws brushing against the soil. It was rich and dark, the kind of earth that could sustain crops. We could grow food here, she said quietly. Jay glanced at her. You're already thinking long-term. She met his gaze, her expression guarded. I must. My daughters need stability. You're not the only one who wants that, he said. Surah tilted her head slightly, studying him. You would stay here? Jay looked back at the river, his smile fading. Maybe. Been drifting long enough. Could be nice to have something solid under my feet for a change. The tranquility of their exploration was shattered by the sharp whine of an approaching engine. Surah's head snapped up, her claws extending instinctively. Get back to the ship, she ordered, her voice sharp. Jay's eyes narrowed as he spotted the source of the noise. A sleek Naren Scout ship streaked across the sky, its metallic hull gleaming in the sunlight. They found us, he muttered, his jaw tightening. Surah hissed softly. ushering her daughters toward the vagabond. We cannot fight them head on. They'll call for reinforcements. Jay followed, his mind racing. We don't need to fight, just need to give them a reason to leave. As the group reached the ship, Jay ducked into the cargo bay and began rummaging through a stack of supplies. What are you looking for? Surah demanded. Something loud, he said. He held up a pair of small devices, their surfaces etched with hastily applied wiring. Explosive drones. Not exactly military grade, but enough to make them think twice. Surah's lips curled into a faint smile. Your chaos may serve us yet. The scout ship landed just beyond the clearing, its engines hissing as they powered down. A ramp extended, and 3 Naren soldiers emerged, their armor gleaming. Surah watched from the ship's viewport, her heart pounding. These weren't mere patrol officers. Their crests marked them as elite hunters, specialists trained to track and capture high-value targets. We don't have much time, she said. Jay nodded, activating the drones. They hovered silently, their small frames emitting a faint blue light. Here's the plan, he said. We draw them into the forest, hit them with these, and slip away while they're busy dealing with the mess. Surah nodded, her claws flexing. I will lead them. They'll expect me to run. Not alone, Jay said firmly. We do this together. She hesitated, then gave a curt nod. The plan unfolded quickly. Surah darted from the clearing, her movements swift and deliberate. The Naren soldiers spotted her immediately, their weapons snapping to attention. After her, one barked, and the trio pursued. Jay followed at a distance, the drones trailing behind him. As the soldiers moved deeper into the forest, he activated the devices. The first explosion shattered the quiet, sending a shower of dirt and leaves into the air. The soldiers stumbled, their formation breaking as they struggled to regroup. Surah took advantage of the chaos, circling back to strike one from behind. Her claws raked across his armor, forcing him to the ground. Jay triggered the second drone, the blast disorienting the remaining soldiers. We need to move, Surah shouted. Jay nodded, his chest heaving. Together, they retreated toward the vagabond. As the ship's ramp closed behind them, the engines roared to life. Jay pushed the controls to their limit, the vessel rising sharply into the sky. Surah stood beside him, her breathing heavy. They'll send more. Let them, Jay said. We'll be gone before they get here. She glanced at him, her expression softening. You could have left us. It would have been easier. Jay smirked. Yeah, but where's the fun in that? For the first time in what felt like ages, Surah allowed herself to smile. As the vagabond ascended into the stars, the planet below grew smaller, but its promise lingered in their minds. A home was within reach, and for the first time, they believed it might be worth the fight. The vagabond hung in orbit above the green and blue planet, its patched hull gleaming faintly in the sunlight. Inside, silence reigned, the crew recovering from the intensity of their recent escape. Surah stood in the cockpit, staring down at the world below, her hands gripping the edge of the console. Jay entered, his usual grin tempered by exhaustion. He dropped into the pilot's chair, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Not a bad getaway, he said. Not a sustainable one, Surah replied, her voice steady but weary. The Narens won't stop hunting us. This planet may not be as untouched as it seems. We cannot keep running forever. Jay leaned back, studying her. What are you saying? She turned to face him, her golden eyes soft but resolute. We need to make a stand. Here. Jay raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? Because making a stand usually comes with a lot of complications. Surah nodded. I have run from my people long enough. If they come, I will face them, but I cannot do it alone. Jay's smirk returned, though his voice held a note of sincerity. You think I've stuck around this long, just to bail now? Her lips curved into a faint smile. You are more loyal than I expected. Don't let it go to your head, Jay said, standing. If this is going to work, we're going to need to get creative. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Surah and Jay worked tirelessly to turn the clearing near the lake into a defensible home. Using parts from the vagabond and resources scavenged from the planet, They constructed makeshift barriers and sensor arrays. Zlay and Trim helped where they could. Zlay's curiosity turned into an invaluable asset as she learned to operate some of the ship's systems, her nimble fingers dancing over the controls with growing confidence. "Does this help, Captain J?" she asked one evening, pointing to a modified sensor she had adjusted. Jay grinned, ruffling her hair. "You're a natural kid. Keep it up." Trim, though still recovering, insisted on helping gather materials from the forest. Her small frame carried bundles of vines and sticks, her determination shining despite her frailty. "You should rest," Surah said softly as Trim approached with another bundle. "I'm strong enough, Mother," Trim replied, her voice quiet but firm. Surah knelt, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You are stronger than anyone I have ever known." The calm broke days later when the proximity alarm blared. Jay and Surah raced to the cockpit, Zlay and Trim close behind. On the display, 3 Naren ships appeared, their sleek designs cutting through the atmosphere like knives. "They've found us," Surah said, her voice tight. Jay cracked his knuckles. Time to see if all this work paid off. He activated the ship's comms, broadcasting a signal to the Naren fleet. "This is Captain Jay of the Vagabond," he said, his tone casual. "You're trespassing on private property. Turn around, or I start charging rent." The reply came swiftly, a cold voice dripping with authority. "Human, surrender the fugitives, and you may yet live." Jay glanced at Surah. "What do you think? Should we negotiate?" Her claws flexed. "No, didn't think so," he said, cutting the transmission. The Naren ships descended, their weapons charging. Surah stood beside Jay, her golden eyes blazing with determination. "Activate the defenses," she said. Jay nodded, flipping a series of switches. The sensor arrays buzzed to life, sending out pulses that disrupted the Naren ship's targeting systems. Explosive traps they had placed in the forest detonated, forcing the invaders to retreat momentarily. Zlay manned the ship's communication console, relaying updates. "The second ship is moving to flank us," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. "Trim," Surah said, kneeling beside her youngest daughter. "Stay here and hide. No matter what happens, do not leave this spot." Trim nodded, her small hands clutching the lapis stone Jay had given her. The battle was fierce. Jay piloted the Vagabond like a dancer navigating a storm, weaving between blasts while firing back with precision. Surah used her knowledge of Naren tactics to anticipate their moves, guiding Jay and the others with sharp, decisive commands. Despite their efforts, one of the Naren ships broke through their defenses, landing just outside the clearing. Surah turned to Jay. "Keep them occupied. I will handle this." Jay grabbed her arm. "You don't have to do it alone." She shook her head. "This is my fight." Jay hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful." Surah emerged from the ship, her claws gleaming in the sunlight. The Naren soldiers stepped forward, their weapons raised. "Traitor," their leader spat. "You shame our people with your weakness." Surah's tail lashed behind her. "If protecting my daughters is weakness, then I embrace it." The leader lunged, but Surah was ready. She moved with the precision of a warrior, her claws striking with deadly accuracy. The other soldiers hesitated, clearly unprepared for the ferocity of her defense. Behind her, Jay appeared, a makeshift stun rod in hand. "Hope you don't mind if I crash the party." Surah smirked. "Try to keep up." Together, they overwhelmed the soldiers, their combined strength driving the invaders back. The Naren ships, damaged and disoriented, retreated into the sky. As silence fell over the clearing, Surah and Jay stood side by side, their breaths heavy. "That," Jay said, leaning on his stun rod, "was way too much fun." Surah shook her head, but allowed a small smile. "You are insufferable." "Yeah, but you'd miss me if I was gone." She didn't reply, but the faint warmth in her expression spoke volumes. That evening, as the stars emerged above the clearing, the small family gathered near the lake. Zlay and Trim sat together, their laughter a soft melody that carried through the night. Surah watched them, her heart swelling with a rare sense of peace. Jay sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "think this could be home?" Surah looked at him, her golden eyes reflecting the starlight. Yes, I think it could. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't just the planet that offered a new beginning. It was the people beside her. Together, they had fought for their place in the universe. And together, they would build a future worth protecting.